very pleased to see that we have a mostly adult audience because there will be some sort of mature pictures in the offing. Okay, well, the passage of photography into the realm of fine art often is recognized by the Getty Museum's purchase of Sam Wagstaff's rapidly acquired collection in 1984 for $5 million. Again, $5 million in 1984. To the extent that there is any prehistory of note, it seems to have begun in the 1970s. Wagstaff and his lover, Robert Mapplethorpe, were famous for being different kinds of outsiders than Jews, that is, as rather open homosexuals. They are regarded as breaching the barricades between obscenity and art and launching the art market in photography into the stratosphere. Well, let's look briefly at a less heralded moment in the high end of photography's consumer culture. Here's an example of what was dismissed as a damp squib in 2002. A few murmurs filled the Christie's showroom off Rockefeller Plaza on Thursday night as one of Richard Avedon's most iconic works, which captures an aloof Marilyn Monroe, failed to reach its low estimate of $100,000. It was the inaugural evening of Christie's fall photography season in October 2012, and the Avedon sale was the keynote event. Avedon's iconic portraits were all in attendance, but also all underperformed. Of course, the failure to move the Marilyn image wasn't enough to halt the night, which ended on a reasonable note with Avedon's hopped-up solarized portrait of the Beatles. It sold, but for $70,000. Overall, the auction was successful, with evening results totaling around $1,500,000 against a low estimate of $1,300,000 and change for the 28 works. That's nothing to be sad about. Still, most of the lots that did sell hovered just above their low estimates, and 30% of the lots didn't sell at all. It seems at this moment a showcase of Avedon's strange, glamorous world doesn't garner much excitement. Josh Holderman, International Director for Christie's Photography Department, described the current market for Avedon as steady. Just 2 years ago, Holderman might have said it was robust. In 2010, at a Paris sale, Avedon's Dovima with elephants sparked a personal record for the photographer in excess of $1 million. Again, $1 million paid for the photograph, end quote. Well, it's taken for granted that those with means are willing to pay what we lowly academics consider a fortune for photography. In a 2012 auction at Sotheby's, an Alfred Stieglitz image of Georgia O'Keeffe's hands and a thimble fetched between $800,000 and $1.2 million. A nude and hands of O'Keeffe in 2016 sold for between $300,000 and $500,000. In 2010, a Robert Capa Spanish Civil War print went for over $10,000, or over 10,000 pounds. These days, it costs more than a nominal fee simply to access the auction and gallery prices paid for photographs. Well, I will argue here that before Wagstaff and Mapplethorpe, and as an essential background to Wagstaff's purchase, there is a long and complicated history of the creation and cultivation of the art market in photography, which was overwhelmingly a Jewish affair. Wagstaff was a WASP, and Robert Mapplethorpe, an Irish Catholic. Of course, Andy Warhol, major figure in this, is also Catholic. But Wagstaff was inspired to champion Mapplethorpe due to his viewing of a show in New York, the Painterly Photograph, from 1890 to 1914, held in 1973. This was largely work by and favored by Alfred Stieglitz that he had published in his journal, Camera Work. Well, in the less rarefied world, even the third world, it may be as common to hang on one's wall a representation of a famous photograph as a reproduction of a painting or a drawing. At college in 1977, I had a poster of Nat Fine's The Babe Bows Out, which my genteel roommate found very weird. Of course, photos of personalities always circulated widely, and this was, I argue elsewhere, something of a Jewish invention. Of course, here we have Mark Twain. This is taken by a photographer who spent a lot of his career in Australia and then also in London, named Barnett. Well, the ubiquitous Ansel Adams Yosemite posters would have been almost unthinkable before the 1960s. The phenomena of the valuing and popularity of photography could not have happened as it did without the overwhelming presence of Jews as photographers, progenitors of photographic discourses, including history, criticism, and publishing, and as vital actors in the art market for photography. Adams, who was not Jewish, was well aware that his work would never have reached the broad masses and reached great wealth without Jews as prime actors in a market where he was a star. Well, I begin with Stieglitz, Kappa, Avedon, and Adams, because Stieglitz was said to have protested the claim, made famous by Waldo Frank, that there was any significance to his Jewishness. Yet he had mixed feelings about being read as Jewish. Richard Avedon, overlapping a bit with Stieglitz, but of a later generation, was one of the few prominent Jews in photography, a heavily Jewish field, who could be termed Jewishly self-aware and articulate about the importance of Jewishness for himself and his wider milieu. Avedon keenly sensed the intimacy between his father's trade in the shmata, or clothing business, and his emergence as a fashion photographer. Few have paused to muse over the irony that the photographs Avedon and others took of fashion have outlasted and outperformed the fashion itself, to which it was initially an instrument of transmission. Ironically, the theoretical work that best describes the phenomena of the art market in photography, which was overwhelmingly created by Jews, is Yuri Slezkina's The Jewish Century. The book, which is simultaneously brilliant and rather wacky, says that Jews engineered the socioeconomic order of the 20th century United States and Soviet Union to a much greater extent than typically is acknowledged. Photography fits Slezkina's argument perfectly. Jews did not invent photography, yet some, in fact, were critical in its advance. More importantly, Jews colonized it and kept pushing it forward and developing subfields. Photography, as it has come to play its massive and complex role in our modern world, could not have had the history it possesses without the weighty factor of Jewish ethnic difference. One of the aspects of both Jewish history and the history of photography, which have been almost completely unexamined, is the history of the so-called art market for photography. The main question with which I'll be concerned here is, how did this evolve with Jews greatly disproportionate as producers, agents, and consumers, which then spread to the world at large? Although there are many reflections about the current state and earlier flashpoints of the art market for photography, most of which only begin in the last decades of the 20th century, there is little scholarship on its earlier history derived from archival research. Through ongoing work on the Jewish engagement with photography, I believe it is possible to establish major watersheds in its development, as illuminated in the careers of Alfred Stieglitz, Beaumont Newhall, Helmut Gernsheim, Andor Krasner-Krauss, Walter Neurath, Lou D. Feldman, Alfred Eisenstadt, Giselle or Gisela Freund, Harry Abrams, Peter Pollock, Paul Strand, Josef Breitenbach, and Richard Avedon. Well, along with the purchase of individual photographs as artwork, often created by Jews, and usually through Jews as agents, here I'll also be concerned with the acquisition of entire collections, mainly the Gernsheim collection by the University of Texas and the Ries-Engelhorn Museum in Mannheim, Germany, and the Breitenbach collection at the University of Munich. Post-1945 West German museums and archives helped substantially to fuel the art market for photography. They recognized that Jewish photographers and agents and editors expelled from Nazi Europe represented a lost cultural treasure. it was determined that these persons and their work might be partly restored to Germany and concomitantly to fortify the myth of a culturally effervescent Central Europe before Hitler. Jewish photographers became part of the myth of Weimar culture and of a resplendent culture in interwar Vienna. The discovery of a Jewish photographic corpus and cohort also led to increasing value and valuing of photographs, generally as German institutions sought and paid high prices for work by Jews and work deemed of Jewish interest. Although it was never admitted expressly, there seems little doubt that the Breitenbach collection of Munich and Gernsheim collection of Mannheim would have been secured if not for the spirit and reality of Wiedergutmachung, or that is trying to compensate for the past on the part of the country and various institutions in Germany. Thus far, there's been little written about the Gernsheim collection, despite its huge role in the history of photography's art market. Concerning the history of the Breitenbach collection of Munich, there is little, if any, reflection on the significant acquisition and collection. I'll argue that Jews continued to be overrepresented as actors in and consumers of the photography art market, ironically, until it started going through the roof, and all sorts of people with money became involved. But almost up through the close of the 20th century, it was a field dominated by persons of Jewish origins and networks between Jews, although this was rarely discussed openly. Relatedly, there was a distinctly German-Jewish dynamic at stake in how photography was treated by arts institutions and municipalities in Europe in the wake of the Holocaust. I'll show a couple of pictures here. This is Stieglitz from the Breitenbach collection. I realize it exists in other places. Here we have Giselle or Gisela Freund, a famous picture of hers of Virginia Woolf. And here we have Helmut Gernsheim. Well, what had been an almost exclusively Jewish discourse, the assertion that photography should be treated as art, became normal. Well, one area where scholars of German Jewry and the Holocaust are beginning to excavate a notable Jewish presence, followed by its abrupt absence, is photography. Jews had been conspicuous and established in working in studios and photo labs, devising and popularizing studio practices, advancing film and optical technologies, participating in empire and state-building expeditions, photojournalism, advertising, fashion and sport photography, the retailing of cameras, film, and photo equipment, and the merging of photography into the fine arts, avant-garde, and social political movements. Much greater scholarly attention, though, has been paid to the picturing and representations of Jews as Jews in Europe and the Holocaust. There is a lot of work done on representations of Jews, and I'm one of the people who's been involved in that myself. Well, a notable exception is the work of David Schneer on Soviet photojournalism, which brilliantly situates the field in its historical context. Yet a great lacuna in contemporary history due to the Holocaust is the very memory of the extent to which Jews predominated among the photographers of Europe and animated nearly every facet of the application and vocations of photography. So Jews were at the cutting edge of photography and changed the shape of mass visual culture, although there is precious little recognition of this in the historiography of photography per se. Well, as a last caveat, I want to diffuse any impression that this might be an exercise in valorization. Part of the reason why there is such a huge disparity between Jews' roles in photography and the extent to which it's been forgotten by Germans, non-Jews, and Jews is because photography was not always considered the most respectable of vocations. That is, no matter how much photographs themselves may have been treasured. This is a cartoon from Punch in 1860, and it was basically understood to be a character of a typical photographer who, as early as 1860 in London, would have been identified as a Jew. Well, sometimes descendants of photographers are unaware of photographers in their own family. On a scholarly level, historians have barely dealt with the problem of why photographers have been obscured or marginalized as a matter of course until quite recently. I believe that photography's problematic relationship with respectability provided a critical opening for Jews, while it also helped obfuscate the heavily Jewishly inflected history of the field. To put it in different words, Jews could get into photography because it was not the kind of respectable profession or trade that a normal person would tend to go into in most places. Therefore, it was an avenue for Jews, unlike many, many other fields. Well, Alfred Stieglitz perhaps did more than anyone to make it possible to see photographic nudes as art instead of pornography. The development of the art market in photography, especially as seen through the career of Josef Breitenbach, reveals works that were originally taken for publications considered obscene, which decades later would be sold for thousands and thousands of dollars or pounds as vintage photographs, as art photographs. Really quite incredible. One of the things I found, and I don't say this to demean me, actually I'm really thrilled. I had a Josef Breitenbach Fellowship. He's a fascinating guy. He did really incredible work, but he was a little bit of a problematic personality in a number of ways. For, boy, a number of reasons. I won't get into all of them here. But one of the things I found from his notebooks was that he used to visit these sort of hotels in Tokyo and other places where basically you did kind of do-it-yourself pornography, or what we call do-it-yourself pornography. He's like, well, he's a photographer, he takes it very seriously. Well, the kind of stuff that he did for various risque and illegal magazines in the beginning is now considered actually work of great art. And I will say, he himself always did take it seriously. He thought it was the rest of society that was wrong in labeling this as obscene, but it really is quite an incredible transformation. I certainly wish I had a few of them myself. Okay, well, Stieglitz opened the door to photography being valued on the same level as art through his curatorial practices in his public studio spaces, 291 and An American Place. He was the first to display art with photography. There were probably private homes in New York where this was being done as well. We know this through the kind of advice that was given to Beaumont Newhall from his teacher Paul Sachs at Harvard. Well, as I said, many of these people were intimates of Paul Sachs, who helped launch a generation of museum professionals from his position at Harvard. Sachs encouraged Beaumont Newhall to pursue those who equally valued art and photography. Stieglitz himself held complicated and contradictory views about high prices being paid, or what he thought at the time was high prices being paid for traditional art, and then later on in his life, photography. Stieglitz did, however, believe that artistic labor and those with vision should be compensated at least to the extent that they were enabled to pursue their work as the source of their livelihood. That is, not having to create art on the side or as a hobby. In other words, he hated the idea that one had to be kind of a stately gentleman in order to pursue photography. He thought that you should be able to actually earn a living through it. Yet the prices that were attached to his own photos even began getting out of hand in his own time, mainly for the express purpose of paying rent for his studio and accommodating the needs, which were many, of Georgia O'Keeffe. Stieglitz sold his work to his admirers, including members of his own and his first wife's family. He was frequently uncomfortable with people giving him more money than he asked, often much more. That is, sometimes he would ask for a certain amount, and somebody would write him a check with zeros added to it, and it kind of freaked him out at the time. That is, people thought his photographs were actually worth a lot of money, much more than he did himself. Well, the attitude of his audience had not been accorded Stieglitz's predecessors, such as Julia Margaret Cameron. Lewis Carroll actually, of course, didn't do commercial photography at all, and David Octavius Hill, who now garner huge sums. In some ways, through his success, Stieglitz helped endow the fledgling photography market with many of the same characteristics that he actually abhorred in the art market per se. Well, so if we recognize the photographs of Stieglitz treated like paintings, which was continued by Stieglitz's non-Jewish protege, Edward Steichen, at the Metropolitan Museum and at the Julian Levy Gallery, where else may we detect substantial bursts in photography being elevated to fine art as the foundation of the art market in photography before the generally recognized watershed of the 1970s? Well, after his brother Helmut escaped to London in 1937, Walter Gernsheim exhibited Helmut's photographs in his art gallery, where he mainly showed old master drawings. A portrait by actually one of the patrons of Walter Gernsheim, and I could say a little bit more about him later on. Helmut, however, turned most of his energy after 1945 to collecting and writing a synthetic history of photography. When Gernsheim started collecting photographs, people thought he was nuts. That is, they really didn't know what he was doing. He would later on be accused of asking people to give him things and profiteering from it, but it's very clear that they had really little sense that he was collecting things that would be eventually doomed to be of great value. Well, Noel Chanin observes that Gernsheim's histories were invaluable as a unique and essential account of photography's development, which provided the basis for the boom in photography auctions after 1970. Okay, one of the reasons for this is maybe some of you here have seen auction catalogs, and of course, auction catalogs for photography, it will list the places where these things are discussed in the literature. And one of the things I found, maybe I'm being a little bit unfair in saying this, but if you look through some of these old catalogs, clearly the main source is Gernsheim, and in many, many cases, I don't think that the people who are putting together the catalogs are giving Gernsheim credit because they're clearly cribbing from his notes. That is, the only sources that they'll have for certain photographers will be for the ones that are listed in Gernsheim. But after a while, maybe they just got sick of writing Helmut Gernsheim, Helmut Gernsheim, Helmut Gernsheim, and then they would make it seem as if they had done their own little research in finding where these things were. I mean, very often in languages they couldn't understand themselves, but this really did help provide this great boost for this phenomena. And of course, it was Gernsheim who brought attention to the importance of Lewis Carroll as a photographer, which was crucial in Wagstaff's appreciation of photography. Without Gernsheim and Lewis Carroll, we probably would not have had Wagstaff and Mapplethorpe. Well, Gernsheim's work on Carroll could not have been possible without German Jewish refugees having taken a commanding role in photography publishing in Britain in the 1950s. Well, Helmut Gernsheim championed the art market in photography in other ways, such as by promoting the work of photographers he considered cutting edge, such as Ferenc or Franz Berko, who was originally Berkowitz, as was Robert Capa's mother, but I won't get into that here, and Giselle Freund. These are the works of Gernsheim. Sorry, I got a little bit behind here. Here we have work of Berko from Budapest, some of his color work. Also, it was Berko and Freund who Gernsheim turned to when he became interested in the subject of Jews in photography. These are really the main people he started discussing it with. I suspect when it became known that Gernsheim had collected color photography as well as supposed classic black and white, it was possible to assign color photography greater values. Many of the early color pioneers were indeed Jews. Well, Peter Pollock, who's best known for his picture history of photography, which is often derided, also was a prime mover in fostering photography as art. His elevation of photography, especially photojournalism, as equal to art, was attempted during his curatorship at the Art Institute of Chicago, where he featured photographers such as Kurtesh and Isis, or Biedermanis. After Chicago, he moved to New York, where he worked for Harry Abrams Publishing, continuing a role he had begun informally while still in Chicago. Among his major efforts were producing limited edition signed photographic books. The books, however, never took off, as did the prints themselves. Well, as mentioned at the outset, there were widespread but uncoordinated efforts to recognize Jews active in photography, especially in Germany and Austria, beginning in the late 1950s. A vast body of literature exists, mostly in the form of exhibition catalogs on individual Jewish photographers, mainly those who escaped Nazi clutches and wound up in England, the United States, Australia, South Africa, South America, and Palestine. Of course, there's very, very little sense of the hundreds, if not thousands, of photographers who were murdered. In terms of writing about photography, which no doubt has a symbiotic relationship to its value, there are a few studies of those who worked as partners and a substantial value on four notable studio photographers from Hamburg. Here we have Josephine Baker, rather nice picture of her, and one by the same photographer of the Kaiser. That is, Jews were overwhelmingly court photographers in Europe, even in the courts, which were not known as being very sympathetic to Jews. Of course, the great exception of this is on the other side of Europe in the Ottoman Empire, where the photographers very often tended to be Armenians, for, in a lot of ways, same reasons why Jews were in Europe. Well, as a few scholars have recognized that there were vital networks of Jews in photography that cut across generational and national lines. Ralph Zachsa has written of the multitude of photography studios in Germany in Jewish hands until 1933, when they were shut down by the Nazis. He shows how so-called Aryans rushed to fill the roles vacated by Jews, also as agents of photojournalists. Christoph Kreitzmuller features two photographic institutions in a superb exhibition and catalog called Final Sale. Really incredible piece of work. This is a training school for the applied arts, and this is a extraordinarily talented photographer known as Ava. Well, last year an exhibition was held at Vienna's Jewish Museum called Shooting Girls, which concentrated on the women who owned and ran most of the quality photo studios in Vienna before the Anschluss. One of the curators confided to me that they began with a few and were quickly overwhelmed when the number grew over 40, constituting by far the majority and leaders in the field. The curators were not aware that at the notorious Mauthausen camp, which was, of course, way outside of Vienna, but actually controlled by the city, at least 125 of the Jewish inmates were professional photographers. Many of them had also come rather recently from Hungary and Poland. Well, photographs both taken by and of Jews seem initially to have become highly valued in the photography marketplace of Germany. In post-war Germany and Austria, beginning in the late 1950s and 1960s, some individuals active in photography, that is non-Jews, began to grapple with the historical eradication of Jews who had been at the heart of or the cutting edge of the field. We have Robert Capa, again, who had rather intricate European connections, Lotte Jacobi. Therefore, photojournalists Alfred Eisenstadt, Giselle or Gisela Freund, Gertie Deutsch, Simon Gutmann, Josef Breitenbach, and Liesl Steiner were all welcomed back to Germany and Austria, as was the pioneering collector and historian Helmut Gernsheim. Erich Salomon, murdered in Auschwitz, was posthumously made part of a German cultural canon. And here are just some of his, I would argue, he is by far the most significant figure in the development of photojournalism internationally, not just in Germany, but also in Britain, and someone who actually was brought to the attention of the world largely by Helmut Gernsheim and by Peter Pollock. So just a few of his important images. Well, all of this served a twofold purpose. It was part of the process of Germans coming to terms with the past, and it was also, as I said before, part of the myth of the creation of Weimar Germany, and especially Berlin in pre-World War II Vienna, as precursors to what we might now call multiculturalism, and as the greatest incubators of avant-garde trends. The selective appropriation of the phenomena as part of this effort, however laudatory it is, has been fragmentary and occasionally distorted in historical reflections. In other words, sometimes you get the impression that, gee, all the photographers made it, or because they were photographers, that meant they had networks and people to call on, but the fact of the matter is that most of them were, in fact, murdered. Well, I want to underscore the German embrace of Helmut Gernsheim and Josef Breitenbach. Oops. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go. Oh. Please, work. Okay, oh, too far. Okay. Well, as personalities, and as, well, you know, both of them rather interesting personalities, and as important collectors of historical photography, both were integrated into what may be seen as a German canon of photography, with reverberations around the world, but not all that often giving credit to these figures. Toward the end of his life, Helmut Gernsheim arranged to sell and then donate the remaining portion of his collection to the Ries Engelhorn Museum in Mannheim, which was not given in the initial repository of his trove to the University of Texas. In the early 1960s, the University of Texas paid Helmut Gernsheim $300,000 for his collection, which I believe was at least as consequential, if not more so, as the 1984 Wagstaff deal for $5 million. That is, when Texas paid that kind of money for Gernsheim, nobody had ever thought of paying that amount for photography, and they couldn't even deal with it honestly in the state politics. Josef Breitenbach's collection of historical photography, now housed at the State Museum of, or the City Museum of Munich, which originally had been shown at its municipal museum, is less known and heralded than that of Gernsheim. Indeed, it's of a smaller scale and not nearly as comprehensive, but it has a number of fabulous pieces. Breitenbach is mainly remembered as a photographer for his portraits of Bertolt Brecht and Max Ernst, and as a teacher of photography of rather diverse and eclectic interests. There seems no doubt, though, that he was invited back to Germany generally, and Munich specifically, as a native son in the late 1970s as an act of restitution. The first stirrings begin in the late 1950s. He was paid well for what's termed in some places his donation, which apparently he had loaned to the collection before its permanent fate was settled. There were a few grand events, publications, and exhibitions to mark the return of Breitenbach to his home country. As early as 1967, we can see through Breitenbach's efforts to sell off his collection that the work of German Jews and refugees, including Blumenfeld, Eisenstadt, and Roman Vishniak, were being accorded relatively high value. One of the things I found is that the first instance of the work of Vishniak, whose work is being featured again in huge exhibitions, and I contributed to a volume that's being launched at the end of this week, that is the first time that sort of biggish money was being paid for photographs of Vishniaks of Jews in Europe was actually by these German museums. Again, it sounds kind of ironic, but I think this is really where we can trace it. So I want to say I think I have an answer to two rather fundamental questions. I realize one is not one that I have really posed here. That is, how and why did Jews initially take up photography as a vocation? And how and why did they begin to treat it as high art? And a lot of this actually has to do with my own family history. I not only come from Rochester and worked at Kodak and know what emulsion and gelatin smells like, but I learned a while ago that there were photographers in my family going back generations, which I thought was a joke growing up in Rochester, this idea that my grandmother's grandfather had been photographer to the Tsar. I thought this kind of joke that people would make up in Rochester, and basically I found out it was true. Well, to the extent that this problem has been posed at all, the hypothesis is that photography was attractive to Jews due to its portability, as it was transferable from one locale to another and offered the opportunity of expansive entrepreneurship. Well, compared to other trades, one of the things that we know is it was relatively easy to receive a permit to practice photography in the Russian Empire, which would allow a Jew who otherwise would be restricted to the horrible Pale of Settlement to travel and live more freely in the Russian interior. And these are indeed important factors. I think I found some others. That is, my own thesis is that Jews became photographers when the craze started, actually in the 1850s and 60s. It is, they were sort of invited to learn photography for various lords of the manor, when they were in these middleman positions on estates in Poland and Lithuania. Okay, just a couple of last comments. But for Central European Jews in the 20s and 30s, it often was rather straightforward. That is, turning a hobby or a sidelight into a vocation. John Gutman, this is one of the major figures who's represented in the fabulous collection here, who would become one of the most respected photographers in the United States, described his transition from art to photography in this way. This is from a letter in the archives. The reason I left Germany as early as 1933 was that I received an official cancellation of my rights to be an art instructor for the Prussian government. I'd been teaching art off and on since 1928. I also was notified that I could not exhibit my paintings and drawings anymore in exhibitions such as the Berliner Succession and the Kunstakademie Art Academy, where I had shown my work before. Another reason that I left was that I witnessed ugly incidents of an anti-Semitic nature by stormtroopers. If I would have stayed, I probably would have remained a painter. I only bought a camera and took up photography as a possible source of income in a depressed America 3 weeks before my departure to America at the advice of my well-informed journalistic friends, end quote. This is almost exactly the same advice given to Helmut Gernsheim by his brother, that he should have no hope of becoming an art historian in Britain. So his brother said, you should become either a dentist or a photographer, because these are the things where you could be able to get a job in Britain. Well, Gutman continues, I arrived New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1933 in San Francisco, which remains my home up to the present. I still continued painting until I entered World War II as a still and motion picture cameraman for the OWI. Had I remained in a Hitler-free Germany, hopefully, I would have become a successful major artist and teacher. I never had the intention to live again in Germany, where I felt I was not wanted, but dishonored and possibly eliminated, end quote. Well, for refugees in Britain from the 1930s to the 1950s, the best means of access to the realm of the arts generally was through photography. The Gernsheims, I've argued elsewhere, revolutionized the relationship between photography and the fine arts in Britain. Okay, this is now as a conclusion. I want to introduce Walter Benjamin into the conversation. Perhaps Benjamin seems best employed for making an argument against photography as art and an art market in photography, famously saying that the mechanical reproduction of a work of art fails to replicate its aura, though he had rather complicated views about photography. But Benjamin, like Stieglitz, thought that all workers toiling in aesthetic fields should be compensated as dignified workers. But there's an even more important reason, or even more important way that Benjamin belongs here, which I'll relate in the form of an observation, which you can say, well, I'm just being terribly unfair and ungenerous to everybody. But I'll say it anyway. I was at a big conference on the history of photography in Rome in November last year. After listening to talk after talk, I thought, what if there was no Stieglitz, no Krakauer, no Benjamin, no Susan Sontag, no Fida, no Brazilier, no Abrams, no Thames and Hudson, which brought photography to the world's attention as art. Barthes and Bourdieu have written on the significance of photography, but often in the most disparaging manner. Perhaps we would treat cameras as largely utilitarian instruments, like, say, refrigerators or washing machines, if not for these figures and their creations. They endowed photography with significance against the grain. Yes, there is a gap between, say, Benjamin writing about Aceh and a businessman paying thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, for his work. But the entire project of Walter Benjamin and the recovery of his thought is about the assessment of culture and criticism and seeing the world in a new light. And now to really, we say, sort of lower the tone. In Philip Ross Portnoy's Complaint and Annie Hall, I think two absolutely signal works in modern Jewish history, we learn that literature, art, and history are not enough. That you have to learn how to read and appreciate photography if you're going to be a really cultured human being in the modern world. So I think this is a part of cultural history that remains obscure, in part because of the complex Jewish history that lies behind it. So I'd say that the radical reconceptualization of photography as art, which was mainly pioneered by Jews, precipitated photography as art in the greater consumer culture, which merits more thoughtful and historical rumination. Thank you very much.